There are names in music that carry the weight of an entire era. Names that don't just sit on record labels, but are etched into the very of American soul. Jackson, Braxton, DeBarge. Names that represent more than just melodies. They represent legacies, dynasties, and the heavy crown of greatness. And then, there is LeVert. In the golden world of R&B, the LeVert name was a sacred seal of quality. It was a promise of raw, unfiltered emotion and a harmony that could shake the foundations of a stadium. But before the world-class stages, before the velvet suits, and long before a double tragedy turned their family song into a haunting funeral dirge, there were just two brothers from Cleveland, Ohio, Gerald and Sean. Two boys born into a lineage of power, chasing a sound that lived in the massive, terrifying shadow of their father. Their father wasn't just a singer. He was Eddie LeVert, the powerhouse lead of the OJs, a man whose baritone could move mountains and whose legacy was a mountain itself. For Gerald and Sean, music wasn't a choice you made. It was a blood debt you were born to pay. When people heard them sing, they didn't just hear talent. They heard the echo of a legend. They heard a younger, hungrier version of their father's group, a bloodline that ran thick with rhythm sweat and a desperate burning need to prove they belonged at the top of a mountain they didn't build. But Gerald, he refused to be just a shadow in his father's kingdom. He was a force of nature, a new kind of soul man, who carried the fire of the old school and the electric swagger of the new. He was a man who could make a stadium full of women weep with a single honey-soaked note, and he could command a stage with the divine authority of a preacher at a revival. He was the voice of a generation, a perfectionist who gave every ounce of his spirit to the microphone until there was nothing left for himself but the silence of an empty room. And Sean was the anchor, the loyal brother, the heartbeat on the drums, the one who didn't care about the flashing lights or the solo glory. He only cared about the bond. He was the quiet, steady strength that kept the LeVert dream from spinning out of control. Together with their childhood friend, Mark Gordon, they built a kingdom of their own. They climbed the Billboard charts until they were looking down at the world, earning standing ovations from the streets of London to the bright lights of Los Angeles. But there is a dark, invisible price for carrying a torch that burns this bright. Their story isn't just about the platinum records, the gold plaques, or the Grammy nominations. It's a story about the crushing weight of expectation, the kind that settles in your bones and never lets go. It's about how the pursuit of perfection, the endless sleepless nights in the studio, the grueling tours, and the silent, suffocating pressure to live up to the name LeVert can slowly erode even the most gifted hearts. It's about a brotherhood that was the world's joy, but a private battlefield of exhaustion and unseen menace. Behind the love songs, something was fracturing. Behind the laughter in the dressing rooms, a cold silence was growing, a silence that would eventually claim them both, just 16 months apart. They gave the world the soundtrack to its romances, but they died chasing the very peace they sang about. This is the story of a family that gave everything to the music, only to have the music take everything in return. This is the rise, the reign, and the devastating fall of the House of LeVert. Grab your breath, because this isn't just a story about R&B. This is about the bloodline of Thunder and the lightning that finally struck it down. Before the world saw the diamonds and the silk, there was only the red dirt of Cleveland and the relentless grind of a basement. In the working-class neighborhoods of Ohio, rhythm wasn't something you bought at a store. It was something you earned in the trenches. That was the world of Gerald and Sean LeVert. But their childhood wasn't filled with the typical sounds of a playground. In the LeVert household, the basement wasn't a place for games. It was a laboratory. It was a cavernous room filled with the scent of old amplifiers and the ghosts of Philadelphia soul. Guitars, keyboards, and microphones stood like soldiers at attention, and in the center of it all stood the General Eddie LeVert. Eddie didn't treat his sons like children when they stepped into that room. He treated them like apprentices to a sacred craft. He knew better than anyone that the music industry would chew up a black artist and spit out the bones if they weren't perfect. So he became their toughest critic. While other kids were outside chasing footballs, Gerald was sitting on that basement floor, eyes wide, watching his father dissect a vocal arrangement. Every breath, every vibrato, every movement was a lesson in survival. "Don't you dare sing a note unless you mean it," Eddie would roar. "If you don't feel it in your gut, the audience won't feel it in theirs." Gerald, the eldest, was obsessed. Even at 5 years old, he wasn't just mimicking his father. He was absorbing him. He practiced until his throat was raw, trying to capture that same thunderous grit that made the OJs legendary. Sean, younger and more reserved, found his place in the pocket. He became the heartbeat, mastering the drums and the subtle art of harmony that holds a group together. Together they weren't just brothers. They were becoming a machine. By the time they reached their teens, Gerald's ambition was a fever. He didn't want to walk in his father's footsteps. He wanted to build a new road. He would stay up until dawn writing songs on scrap paper and recording demos on cheap cassette tapes that hissed with static. He recruited his childhood friend Mark Gordon, a musical prodigy who could play the violin and the piano with equal grace. They called themselves the Playmates. Sneaking into local bars and talent shows, they were legally too young to enter, just to feel the heat of the spotlight. But the first time they brought their music to Eddie the General didn't salute. He listened to their tapes with a stone-cold face and handed them back. "Go back. Write it better. It's too soft. It sounds like a shadow of me," he told them. It was a crushing blow, but it was exactly the fire they needed. They went back to that basement lab and stayed there for months. They stripped away the imitation and found their own soul, a blend of their father's classic grit and the new electric energy of the street. They stopped trying to be the OJs and started becoming LeVert. Finally, when Eddie heard the spark he was looking for, he moved. But the industry wasn't ready. Every major label said the same thing. "They're good, but we already have the OJs. We don't need a remake." So Eddie did what a father does. He bet on his blood. Alongside his friend Harry Coombs, he launched an independent label, Tempri Records, built specifically to launch his sons into the stratosphere. In 1985, they released their debut album, I Get Hot. It wasn't a global explosion yet, but it was a declaration of war. Thanks to Eddie's pull, they landed a spot on Soul Train, standing on the same stage their father had conquered a decade before. The national spotlight hit them, and for the first time, the world saw what that basement lab had created. They weren't just kids with a famous last name. They were a polished powerhouse trio ready to claim the throne. The LeVert era had begun, and the Bloodline was about to become a household name. But as the applause grew louder, the lessons from the basement began to take on a darker tone. Excellence was no longer a goal. It was the only way to stay alive. By 1986, the basement in Cleveland was a world away. LeVert was no longer just a project or a hopeful experiment by a famous father. They were a movement. When their first major label album, Bloodline, hit the shelves, it wasn't just a title, it was a manifesto. It was Gerald, Sean, and Mark Gordon telling the world, "We carry the fire of the past, but we own the future." They weren't just the sons of a legend. They were architects of a new sound. And then it happened. The lead single, Pop, Pop, Pop Goes My Mind, didn't just climb the charts, it exploded. It shot straight to #1, and suddenly the sons of Eddie LeVert were no longer standing in a shadow. They were the ones casting it. Audiences had never seen anything quite like them. Gerald's voice was a brilliant paradox. It was as smooth as expensive silk one second, then raw and thunderous, like a summer storm the next. He didn't just sing the lyrics, he inhaled them. When he stood at the edge of the stage, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes locked onto the crowd. He wasn't just a performer. He was a preacher of soul, and the audience was his congregation. Every woman in the building believed he was singing just for her, and every man in the room wanted to know how to command a space with that much gravity. But if Bloodline opened the door, 1987's The Big Throwdown blew the entire house apart. The fuse for that explosion was a song called Casanova. It was lightning in a bottle, a masterclass in a sound that would eventually define the late 80s. It was a perfect collision of old-school grit, street-level funk, and high-gloss pop. It didn't care about genres. It only cared about making you move. The song smashed into the top 5 of the Billboard Hot 100, earned them a Grammy nomination, and turned 3 kids from Ohio into global cultural icons. On tour, the energy was pure, unadulterated madness. They shared the stage with giants like New Edition and LL Cool J, but LeVert had something the others didn't. They were the bridge between generations. They had the synchronized moves and the matching suits of their father's era, but they had a swagger and a heavy beat that belonged to the hip-hop generation. Gerald was the undisputed centerpiece, a man who could out-sing the veterans and outdance the rookies. Behind the scenes, the LeVert machine was working overtime. Gerald wasn't just singing, he was becoming a mogul. Alongside Mark, he began shaping the sound of R&B for everyone else, producing hits for stars like Mickey Howard and Troop. His work ethic, learned under the strict eye of his father, was now a relentless engine. He was in the studio 20 hours a day, writing, arranging, and demanding perfection. By 1988, they pushed the boundaries even further with Just Coolin'. The title track featured Heavied and became a milestone, one of the first successful collaborations between a major R&B group and a rapper. It was bold, it was fresh, and it was proof that LeVert was unstoppable. But success has a weight all its own. As Gerald became the undeniable face of the group, the dynamic began to shift. The industry, the cameras, and the fans began to focus solely on the man at the microphone. While Sean and Mark were the bedrock, the world was falling in love with the voice. Behind the laughter on the tour bus and the gold plaques on the walls, a new kind of pressure was mounting. Gerald was carrying the weight of a family legacy and a massive industry on his shoulders. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air became, and the dream was starting to demand more than just his voice. By the early 1990s, Gerald LeVert had become more than just a singer. He was a force of nature, a cultural heartbeat for an entire R&B generation. But for a man built from the red clay of Cleveland and the iron discipline of a soul legend, success was never a place to rest. It was a restless, hungry thing that demanded more every single day. It was never enough for Gerald to just sing the love songs. He wanted to own the very air the music breathed. He wanted to write it, produce it, and live it so deeply that eventually there was no line left between the man and the melody he created. After the massive success of the Rope-A-Dope style album, the group LeVert was still riding a golden wave of chart-topping dominance. But in the dark, smoky corners of the industry and the high-rise offices of Manhattan, the whispers were growing into a deafening roar. People were saying that Gerald was the real star. They said he didn't need a group to hold him up anymore. They said his talent was too massive, too volcanic to be shared with anyone else, even his own blood. And deep down in those quiet, lonely moments between the deafening screams of the fans and the sterile silence of his hotel rooms, Gerald began to believe it himself. He loved his brother Sean and his lifelong friend Mark with a fierce, unbreakable loyalty, but he felt an undeniable pull towards something singular. He needed to prove once and for all that he could carry the heavy crown of the LeVert name without a safety net or the guiding hand of a trio. In 1991, with a sense of quiet heartbreak, but with the ultimate stoic blessing of his father, Eddie, Gerald stepped out into the light alone. He released his debut solo album, Private Line. It was a high-stakes gamble on his own identity, a moment where he laid his entire soul bare for the world to judge. But the world didn't just listen, they surrendered. The title track was a masterclass in sultry modern soul, showcasing a maturity that the group hadn't yet reached. Yet the true, emotional center of the record, the moment that stopped the world in its tracks, was a duet with his father called "Baby, Hold On to Me." That song became one of the most iconic and tear-jerking moments in the entire history of soul music. It was more than just a hit. It was a public passing of the torch. Two generations of LeVert men, two vocal powerhouses with the same thunder in their throats and the same fire in their hearts, standing side by side as equals. It went straight to #1 and sold over 1 million copies almost instantly. For the first time in his 48-inch frame of a life, Gerald wasn't just the son of Eddie LeVert. He was Gerald LeVert, a superstar in his own right, standing on the peak of a mountain he had carved with his own bare hands. But fame is like a wildfire. It burns with a brilliant, blinding light, but it ruthlessly consumes everything in its path. While Gerald was climbing to these new, dizzying heights of solo stardom, the bond that held the original trio together began to strain under the immense weight of his absence, while Mark and Sean desperately wanted the brotherhood to stay united. Gerald was being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. He was producing for giants like Barry White, Teddy Pendergrass, and the Rude Boys. He was in the recording studio all night long on a private jet all morning, and staring back from a magazine cover by sunset. His work ethic, forged in that unforgiving basement in Cleveland, was legendary. But it was also becoming a slow-motion tragedy that no one knew how to stop. Friends and family would often see the dark, heavy circles under his eyes, and the way his massive shoulders slumped when the cameras finally turned off. They would plead with him, "G, you've got to slow down. You're only human, man." But he would just flash that famous, charming smile, the one that could hide 1,000 secrets and 10,000 sorrows, and say, "I'll rest when I win that Grammy. I'll sleep when the work is finally done." But for a man like Gerald, the work was never done. He became a relentless perfectionist haunted by his own impossible expectations. He gave his entire heart to the stage every single night, leaving absolutely nothing for the man he saw in the mirror the next morning. He dated superstars and lived in the lap of luxury, but true, lasting love remained a ghost he could never quite catch. He was the man who sang about intimacy to millions of strangers, yet he spent his lonely nights in the cold blue glow of a recording console, chasing a sound that he hoped could finally fill the growing emptiness he felt inside. By the time he formed the supergroup LSG in 1997, he was at the absolute peak of his powers, but his body was starting to whisper a dark warning that his brilliant mind simply refused to hear. By the mid-2000s, Gerald LeVert was a king in the world of R&B, but his throne was starting to feel like a cage. He had achieved everything a musician could dream of: platinum records, a devoted global fan base, and a legacy that stood shoulder to shoulder with the giants. But the price of that crown was a toll on his body and soul that he had been paying in silence for years. The man who sang with such effortless power was now finding it harder and harder just to catch his breath. The industry's demand for perfection never slowed down, and Gerald, the eternal soldier of soul, refused to surrender. He was still the first one in the studio and the last one to leave. He was still producing for his father, still recording his own solo projects, and still touring the world. In early 2006, he took a career-defining trip to South Africa with his father, Eddie. They performed for tens of thousands and even met Nelson Mandela. It was a spiritual peak, a moment of profound pride for the LeVert bloodline. But when Gerald returned to Cleveland, he was a ghost of his former self. He was physically drained, his heart weakened by years of chronic stress, untreated pneumonia, and the mounting weight of his own frame. He complained of shortness of breath. He spoke of a fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. He went for medical checkups, but the doctors, perhaps blinded by his larger-than-life persona, told him he was healthy enough to keep going. So he did what he always did. He pushed through the pain. He turned to prescription medications, Vicodin for his aching joints, Xanax for his crippling anxiety, and Percocet to numb the exhaustion of a body that was screaming for rest. He wasn't looking for a high. He was looking for a way to stay on his feet for the next show, the next session, the next person who needed him. Then came the quiet Friday of November 10th, 2006. In his home in Cleveland, the city that raised him and the city he never left, the music finally stopped. A family member found him unresponsive. By the time the news hit the airwaves, a cold shockwave traveled through the heart of every R&B fan in the world. Gerald LeVert was dead at just 40 years old. The medical examiner would later rule it an accidental overdose, a fatal cocktail of prescription drugs and over-the-counter cold medicine that his overworked heart simply couldn't handle. The silence that followed was deafening. Over 7,000 people flooded his funeral, a sea of grief that included legends like Stevie Wonder and Patti LaBelle. But the most heartbreaking sight was Eddie LeVert, the man who had trained his son in that basement lab, the man who had shared the stage and the spotlight with him, standing over the casket of his firstborn. At the end of the service, Eddie and Sean stood together to sing "Dance with My Father." Their voices, usually so strong and full of thunder, cracked and broke under the weight of a sorrow that no melody could ever heal. Gerald had once said he would rest when he won his Grammy. In a cruel twist of fate, that Grammy would come, but he wouldn't be there to hold it. He had given everything he had, every note, every breath, every ounce of his soul, until there was nothing left but the echo of his voice. He died a superstar, but he died a man who was simply too tired to carry the legacy any further. The king was gone, and for the house of LeVert, the darkness was only beginning to deepen. The death of Gerald LeVert had left a hole in the universe, but for his brother Sean, it was as if half of his own soul had been ripped away. Sean had always been the anchor, the quiet brother who stayed in the pocket, content to let Gerald shine while he held down the rhythm. But with Gerald gone, the anchor was drifting in a sea of grief. And just 16 months later, that drift would lead to a tragedy so senseless, it would leave the nation in shock and the LeVert family in ruins. In March 2008, Sean LeVert was struggling. The grief over his brother, combined with the pressures of maintaining the family business, had taken a toll on his mental health. He was struggling with severe anxiety, a condition he managed with a prescription for Xanax. During this turbulent time, he was taken into custody at the Cuyahoga County Jail in Cleveland for unpaid child support. It was a legal issue, a mistake of a private citizen, but the system treated him with a coldness that bordered on the criminal. When Sean entered that jail, he did what any responsible patient would do. He informed the staff of his medical needs. He told them about his heart disease, his sarcoidosis, and most importantly, his dependency on his anti-anxiety medication. But the jail's policy was rigid and heartless. They confiscated his Xanax. They ignored his pleas. They looked at the son of a legend, a man who had given the world so much music, and they saw nothing but a number in a cell. What followed was a slow-motion nightmare. Deprived of the medication his body relied on to stay calm, Sean began to descend into the hell of acute withdrawal. He started to hallucinate. He panicked, screaming about imagined emergencies involving his wife and children. He wasn't being difficult. He was losing his mind because his chemistry was crashing. Instead of medical help, the guards gave him restraints. Instead of a doctor, he got isolation. On the night of March 30th, 2008, Sean LeVert's heart. The same heart that had provided the beat for so many hits couldn't take the strain anymore. He collapsed in his cell, struggling to breathe, terrified and alone. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. At just 39 years old, Sean followed his brother into the silence. The autopsy cited complications from heart disease and withdrawal. But the truth was written in the negligence of the system. The double blow was almost more than the LeVert patriarch could bear. Eddie LeVert, a man who had spent his life giving a voice to the struggle of Black America, now had to bury his second son in less than 2 years. The image of Eddie at Sean's funeral, his face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to age him a decade in an hour, is a haunting reminder of the fragility of life. The family fought back, filing a wrongful death lawsuit that eventually resulted in a $3 million settlement. But money couldn't bring back the rhythm section of the family. However, out of the darkness, a small light emerged. His death led to the passage of Sean's Law in Ohio, a landmark piece of legislation requiring every county jail to provide proper medical and mental health screenings upon intake. Sean LeVert died in the dark, but his tragedy ensured that others might finally be seen. 2 brothers gone before they reached the age of 41, leaving a father to sing their songs alone, and a legacy that was now defined as much by its pain as it was by its beauty. The spotlights have dimmed and the tour buses have long since stopped rolling. The house in Cleveland, once filled with the thunderous laughter and competitive spirit of 2 brothers, is quiet now. But in the world of R&B, the silence left by Gerald and Sean LeVert is not an empty one. It is a silence filled with the echoes of 1,000,000 heartbeats that their music helped heal. The story of the LeVert brothers is often told through the lens of tragedy, the accidental overdose, the cold jail cell, the father left to bury his sons. But to remember them only by their end is to miss the beauty of their beginning. Gerald and Sean didn't just sing songs, they built a bridge. They took the grit and soul of their father's generation and dressed it in the swagger of their own. They proved that you could be a Casanova and still have a heart that bled for the truth. Gerald's legacy in particular remains a towering pillar of soul music. In 2008, 2 years after his passing, the industry finally gave him what he had chased his entire life, a Grammy Award for Best Traditional R&B Performance. He wasn't there to walk up the steps or give the speech, but the gold trophy served as a final bittersweet confirmation of what his fans had known all along, that he was a master of his craft, a man who gave so much of his spirit to the songs that he became part of them. And then there is the legacy of Sean. His death was a dark injustice, but it birthed a light that continues to save lives today. Sean's Law stands as a silent guardian in the hallways of Ohio's justice system, A reminder that every human being, regardless of the mistakes they've made, deserves the dignity of care. Because of Sean, thousands of people who walk into a cell with a medical condition now walk out alive. His rhythm didn't stop in 2008. It transformed into a heartbeat of change. Today, Eddie LeVert still takes the stage with the OJs. He is older now, his hair a crown of silver, his face etched with the lines of a man who has seen the highest peaks and the deepest valleys. When he sings Love Train, or For the Love of Money, he isn't just performing for a crowd. He is singing for the two boys who used to sit on his basement floor. He is singing for the brothers who carried his name to the top of the world and back again. The House of LeVert is not a house of ghosts. It is a house of anthems. Every time a young artist picks up a microphone and tries to find that perfect blend of honey and gravel, Gerald is there. Every time a group harmonizes in the dark, trying to find that perfect pocket, Sean is there. They taught us that fame is fleeting and the industry is cold, but soul is forever. They were the brothers who gave us the soundtrack to our lives, the music for our first loves, our deepest heartbreaks, and our Sunday mornings. They lived fast, they loved hard, and they left us far too soon. But as long as a single record is spinning and a single voice is crying out for love, the harmony of the LeVert brothers remains unbroken. Rest in power, Gerald. Rest in peace, Sean. The song isn't over, it's just waiting for the next beat.